Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Richard Young. Richard, welcome.
Hello, Dan. Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on. Really looking forward to a dynamic conversation today. I think we're going to be going in so many different directions based on your rich history in sport. But let's start where we always do. Let's do some introductions. Richard, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Sure. I grew up in Toronto, but started in England. So dad's a Geordie. Had a pub in the basement called the Magpie, so you can see what sport he was into. In my mother's roots were Irish. So we settled in Toronto, grew up there, fell in love with cycling, dabbled in sports, and I was on an Olympic mission kind of early, and was dabbling in judo and soccer and gymnastics and things, and then had a bike trip to England. Had a cycle with my uncle who looked pretty pro, and I said, "Wow, you look like you've raced before." He said, "Oh, I've done the Tour de France," and I thought, this could be it. And he wasn't blood uncle, but anyways. And then I just fell in love with everything about cycling and the color, the speed, the European focus of it. So I turned into a sprinter, and that was it. Loved it. Fell in love with that. And then did make it to the Olympics in '88, and then got into coaching after that. So 92, I had a top teammate, Kurt Harnett, who was world record holder. So you can imagine I was a lot of second places to him, and learned a stack from him. I started to notice the leadership skill of the best athletes out there that started to stand out to me in cycling. Moved into coaching, coached the women and sprinters as well, and through to Atlanta, and then decided it's time to move on. I'd finished a PhD in a postdoc by then. Actually, partway through the postdoc, I did the postdoc to get my athletes into the Human Performance Lab in Calgary for free. I was told, hey, you could cut the cost if you were here for a postdoc. I thought, well, why not? And so the degrees didn't quite link, but I made them link just through curiosity. And the mix of grad school and cycling worked really well for me. So then after coaching, I did the Olympic Academy, which every country has, and it's more the social aspect of the Olympics. And then I got into the International Olympic Academy in Greece, in Olympia. So I went there right beside the Emperor's Box. There's a university kind of campus there, and you study the Olympics, 2 people from every country. And the world, that kind of changed my outlook. And I thought there's something deeper than the medal. And there's something bigger about the Olympic ideals and Olympic values. And I was invited back as a teacher and discussion leader the next year. And so I went back and asked for a one-way ticket because I wasn't sure what I wanted to be doing, but I knew an adventure was ahead if I didn't plan to come back to Canada. Sat beside a lady with a Scottish accent. I planned to hike around Scotland, and I said, "Hey, where do you think I should hike?" And she says, "Well, there's a good one right by my house." And so that was it. So we ended up hiking together, and then we married the next year. And so we settled in England. I worked at the Coaching Foundation. That was mostly setting up a coaching program for high-performance coaches. So the privilege there was interviewing the best coaches in Britain for about 2 years and setting up specialized programs for them. Learned a stack about the repeat medalists who had a system and how simple their requests were compared to the others, and things started to stand out to me. And then I was recruited by UK Sport, and they were starting UK Institute. This is back in 2000. And I was asked to set up science medicine, and there also looked like some great contacts in Britain in Formula One, as you know. I know that's some of your background, and the military. So to bring tech, my last degree was biomedical engineering, and I developed sport tech. And so I had kind of a curiosity about that and good signals, accurate signals in sport. So set that up for the British team, and did that for 4 years until I hired the best person I could find who ran it for another 15 years. I have a good history of hiring good people. And so it's still running. He's not there, but the program still runs. And then my wife and I took a break. She was an athlete advisor, had been a teacher and a scholarship runner in the States. She was Scottish, but became an athlete advisor in Bath. And I was working in London. Our favorite coffee shop got closed and it was for sale. And we looked and we said, let's do it. And so we left our jobs. We'd hired good people. So we left our jobs and bought it and ran a live music cafe in Bath for 3 years. And it turned out to be a sport hub. So we had more people from sports show up there than we ever had our whole time working. Um, and then we had our son. Suddenly, the cafe and bar scene didn't cut it anymore, and the Kiwis just at the same time approached me to set up the innovation program here in New Zealand. That's where I live, and so set that up, and that's basically the history I've had is creating programs and helping sport find a competitive advantage in setting those programs up. So I did that, and then I moved into learning the impact of debriefs and evidence and behavior, and measured that in medalists and non-medalists. And then went consulting and expanded that further, and now work internationally across a number of sports in a number of countries, and I help leaders and experts simplify their performance system to find breakthrough. And that's what I do, and that brings me to here.
That's a fairly rich history, Richard, to say the least. And look, there's so many threads I can pull upon here, but I'd love to take you back to the Olympic Games, 88, 92. The mental side of cycling for you at that time. Was that something that was at the forefront of your mind? Was it prominent? Did you have help on that at that time? Yeah, just get in that time machine and take us through things.
Yep, yep. So we had coaches, one coach in particular, who was heavy on the mental side, and that we were getting distracted as a team, and we needed to focus. So he was the type who taped our encouraging word onto the back of the bike in front of us on the seat post, and we had a sports psych join us. We had a training camp in LA, and we had a sports psych from the NFL join us. But the challenge was no relationship. So in dropped this person with some good theories and ideas, but we had no relationship, and a bit of skepticism from others in the group, which kind of started to get amplified a bit, and that didn't work. I decided to go to a psych in Toronto and at York University. And so I cold called somebody, and I went and I realized, oh, this is a researcher, and she was curious on what made me tick rather than how can I cycle faster. So I didn't find the one that really gelled for me, and I'd read a ton, including some of the meso, micro, and pseudobompa and things, that I was trying to look for how you structure a program and add in psych. So when I have preparation, how do I polish the top end with psych? And I knew I was distracted, and I was consumed. I was a problem solver, and so I was consumed with the problems. And tech was one of my consuming thinking areas, and so I got into meditation through the advice of another cyclist psychologist, and that worked. Suddenly, I had an internal kind of frame for me, but I'd always been looking for that relationship with sports psych because I'd seen the power of that in a lot of riders, and the others who were wandering with an experiment they were trying to figure out themselves. And that's where I felt I was.
Really interesting that you had to go out there and find somebody to help you, and even then it sounded like it was a bit of a mission back then to find something. Obviously the emergence of sports psychology, I mean, it was pushing through at that
Mm.
time. Question for you. You mentioned that your cycling colleague at the time was breaking world records left, right, and centre.
Mhm.
I think Hartnett,
Kurt Harnett.
Harnett,
Yeah.
beg your pardon. So, did you feel that your engagement with sports psychology helped you get a little bit closer to that rider, or really was he just that much ahead that really any kind of psychological intervention was never going to help you to compete with that rider?
Yeah, yeah. He was a fantastic teammate, but physically he had a completely different makeup to me in
Okay.
sprinting. If I looked at it, and I have in hindsight, I was probably in the wrong event. I probably should have been in the 4K, not the 1K. My structure was different, and I did everything in the gym possible to build the structure. And I got close. I won the Pan Am Games, and fifth in the world, but that was in a tandem sprint, which are quite unique events. So there was delivery with the frame I had, and I knew it wasn't so much psychology because I did have a routine. It was mostly physical,
Yeah.
but I realized the power of it when I started coaching. To be honest, that's when I needed support around me, and I needed specialist help.
Did that experience then influence your approach as a coach? I mean, post 92, when you were around about that time, did the experiences you had as a cyclist really influence how you approached your coaching practice?
It did. It did. Yeah. Because I realized I was happy to experiment with myself. And then now I had athletes in front of me, and I thought, this is not the type of coach they want to be running repeated experiments here. And so I needed to test my thinking with other experts around because I knew they had people only have 4 to 8 years, 4 years usual in an Olympic cycle. Most of my work has been in the Olympics, and and so 4 years. So to be fiddling around with all sorts of ideas is just delaying. And that actually, towards the end of my work and my research, that's what was proven, that there was a lightness at the front when athletes were just getting in, a lightness at the end when they figured out what worked, and then this busy middle of congested stuff and all the options and things, and psychology was in there. So I chose experts early, and sort of divested some of the my gaps, and brought in people to fill. And I knew I wasn't a sports psych, and but I needed somebody with a relationship who would involve me as well, so that I wasn't completely out of the picture. And did find somebody, and we had a really solid relationship.
I'm going to be testing your memory here, so please excuse me. But subsequent to your coaching, you went into a camp around the Olympic Games, and you started to understand that perhaps the values, the ideals are deeper than the medal. You studied medalists and the systems that they used. If you could get in a time machine, go back to be a coach, when you think about the time that you were coaching, you were a cycling coach, given the experiences you've had subsequently, which is many years. When you reflect back, what would you do differently as a coach with relevance to what you did back then?
So there was an add in more flavor to the whole program. Really, not only the program I was running, but generally the theme was there's magic somewhere, and it could be another country. We were constantly looking at best practice in other places. Like Dave Brailsford said, marginal gains. We were on the hunt for marginal gains, and we were just burying a good program in marginal gains. And that's what I realized. We didn't have the basic structure in shape to innovate on top of that. So we kept going to innovation and something new and something new, and we weren't clear on the problem. So in hindsight, and I learned that through those coaching interviews, through the medalist, non-medalist work, seeing how repeat championship capable systems do it, it is very simple. And I used to ask people when they'd say, you got to get the basics right. And I'd say, what are the basics? And I couldn't find anybody who could answer them because it's context and etc. But I have talked to people since who can answer it, and they know what the big rocks are. And so, in hindsight, I would have paid more attention to the problems we're trying to solve. They all looked like they needed to be solved, and there was too much clutter.
That's really interesting. So you were, in essence, doing marginal gains before marginal gains became a thing, but the marginal gains became a distraction because the core principles or the foundation or the basics, as you might call them, weren't in place. That's what I'm hearing you say.
That's right. That's right. So all the gains need to be layered on top of rock solid basic structure and a performance system, I call it. So the best have a performance system. And when you add gains, they're actually well placed and they fit. Otherwise, they're just complications. So I kind of the analogy is kind of like a bone. So if you break a bone and the cast it's reset and the cast just prevents movement, it'll remesh. If it needs a pin, now we have a complication. It's come from the outside, and the mesh has to somehow integrate. That's what the marginal gains were like for people who don't know their basics. They're just layering on layering. And that's what I found in the innovation programs. I did sit a number of times and think, man, I'm a distraction. Like I have to help them get clear. And that's what I eventually turned into. And I got known as the problem guy because I just asked questions until I was clear that they were clear on the problem. And then we knew what to layer in, which gain actually was worth pursuing.
So, for all those coaches listening in and the key decision makers within organizations, are you suggesting you talk about this term performance system? At what levels are you talking about? Every level here? Are you talking about the macro, the meso, and the micro level? That at the macro level, the organization needs the performance system broadly distributed across the athletes and the coaches, and then at the level, perhaps the team needs the shared mental model within this performance system, and then at the micro level, individuals need their own performance system. Are you talking about those kind of levels and layers whereby performance systems need to be discovered and constantly worked upon before marginal gains are looked at?
Yeah, I think so. Exactly as you say there. So it's a layering of ecosystems, and there isn't really an isolated component. They all integrate, including home life. So a lot of the work I do now is also bringing high performance into the home, and it takes the edge off. There's no permission, there's no role, no one's waiting for a decision. Especially kids and partners and things. But high performance is communication, and it's a performance system that helps create the environment for that communication system. And if our home life isn't performing, then we've got a challenge. And so, like you said on micro meso, the layers are right through to where we live, who we live with, to the organization, to the international federation. That's the system. People, places, and things, and how they interact around us.
That's really interesting because I mean, obviously, I want to get on to a conversation around what you discovered when you interviewed these medalists and what these kind of principles might be. But what I'm hearing you say, if you take the macro, the meso, the micro levels, ultimately, when we think about the human being, it comes down to the human being and human beings. And certainly in my work, I think of biopsychosocial, body, mind, world, essentially. And what I'm
Mm,
hearing you say is, you've spoken about going into the home there. So the socio-cultural narrative is important here. It impacts the bio and the psycho. There's that interaction, isn't there?
mm,
So
mm,
these levels
mm,
and biopsychosocial, these factors are important to you within performance systems.
that's right. That's right.
So tell me about the conversations you had with these medalists. Where did that investigation piece of research start for
Mm.
you? And tell us about what you discovered.
Yeah, yeah. So we had a leader, Alex Bauman, here in New Zealand, who was a double gold medalist. He's a Canadian, a double gold medalist and double world record. So two golds in world record. So kind of the ultimate Olympic medals. But he's a system person, and he's been a leader in a number of areas, and so innovation was right up his alley. And so he was leading the high performance program here, and then him and I were talking about all the debriefs that have been done. And they weren't being added up. They were about to be binned. So 2 Olympics worth of interviews were about to be binned. And my hunch was that we can text analyze these for patterns. So since we've taken the time of everybody in the system over 5 Olympics, what would the patterns of what people say they did tell us when we compare it to performance? And then we look at their system of support, the leader, the coach, and the sports system they're in, and then start to compare across sports. And we align language, and then we keep measuring and keep measuring and keep measuring and deepen this study. So that was where it came from. And it also was triggered by a conversation I had with someone who turned into a mentor, Richie Polton, who was the director of the Dunedin study. The town I'm in is Dunedin, and right across the street, I worked at the stadium. That's where the high performance center was, is the Dunedin study. And they studied babies born in 1973 every year right through till now. And this cohort, and then it's stretched out to every 3 years and every 5, and they've got an intake now, I think. And so he didn't set this up, but he was the leader, and he was a sport fanatic. And he was named after Richie Beno, the cricket player.
Yep.
That's where his Richie name came from. So we hit it off. We had such a connection, and we were looking at the longevity of measuring repeat performers and the system they're in. And he's a social scientist, so he was looking at the impact of this in the broader perspective of families and talent identification, et cetera. So there were bigger things he was interested in. And I was also interested in the system of performance and how can we optimize this to speed up the experiment for people and give more people more chance to be as good as they can be and learn how to be a leader as well so that they move on and they're more as a result of high performance sport, not squished and less. So that's where it came from. So between Alex saying, I think this is a pretty good idea, and Richie saying, well, here's a system we've used for almost 50 years. How about we join together? That's where it came from. So the analysis, I started to tap into people like the Dreyfus brothers who were involved. Patricia Benner, who is a nurse educator. Peter Senge reviewed it, Anders Ericsson. So there are different people that I went to. I just looked for the best in the system game and the expert game, just so that we've got the right setup here. So, and I continue to measure. I've broadened this out to look at how does this apply in other contexts as well. Is this just a cultural finding? But no, it's not. So we are able to add up and compare sports and then continually engage the performance directors, who are the people that there's a leader for every Olympic sport, and we bring them together repeatedly and go through the data and compare kayak with rugby and yachting with equestrian and sports that didn't think they could compare. We could now compare because we'd aligned language. We were asking now the same questions in the debrief, which we stopped calling a debrief, by the way. So it's a pre-brief because we're informing the next event. And that's the other thing we discovered in this is that it's typically outsourced. So all the thinking is somewhere else in another boardroom, and we needed to be doing the thinking. And when you get an interviewer, they need to sound like in the report that they know what they're seeing in an event they haven't been at, in a context they don't fully understand. And all the questions are really for their understanding. When you look deep into it, it's not to inform the next performance. There were very few decision questions. Very rarely were they asked, and what would you do next? So we've got the core person in front of us, and the question of what would you do next was rarely asked. So we shifted the dial on the pre-brief setup so that we could tighten the data. And patterns appeared. So I was comparing water with target, combat with winter, and looking at all men with women, forward facing like kayak compared to backward facing like rowing, looking at any possibilities. Some funny things happened there. I'll tell you about that one. And it turned out medalists and non-medalists showed the difference. So in what they said. including one very simple fact. We would ask them for the next pinnacle event, what would you keep, what would you start, and what would you stop? 5% of the athletes were repeat medalists, and they owned 80% of the stops. And it started to tell us, so they're deleting more than anybody else. And the others even struggled to say what they would delete. We noticed their sentences. There's a book called The Power of Pronouns, written by a professor in the US, and I went to see him. And it turned out he had a partner who was a doctor in Auckland. Fantastic. Went to see him. And he was using this narrative to compare the rate of recovery in burn patients. And so analyzing letters they were sending, and he could tell who was excelling, not just the positive aspect, but in the grammar, in the tone, in the intent, in the pronouns of what they were describing. He could identify and relate it to the rate of recovery. So it was almost performance related. And so we started to connect some dots, Dreyfus Brothers as well, and we uncovered some patterns. And we were looking not at attributes that we can't do anything with, like hardworking and all those things that we expect, doesn't matter. What are the learned skills that we can do something with here? And that's what we compared.
And would you be able to share anything with us in terms of what came out of that?
Sure. Yeah. So they've got a number of things. They know the world they're in, so they're very clear on the evidence, and they are measuring what matters. And the non-medalists were more hopeful, so they had a tone of hope rather than no. And it wasn't just because they hadn't won a medal. It was their frame of the truth about their current reality. So repeat medalists were very clear and very honest about current reality. There was a fixing mentality in the non-medalists, and there was a creation mentality and focus in the medalists. So they were making things happen, and they weren't fixing problems. So there was a lot of problem fixing, a lot of problem identification, a lot of groaning about stuff that didn't come up. And the tone of and this was because we were pre-briefing, we were measuring before they were getting a medal. So once we had the medal, we could backtrack and see, oh, look at this. It's not just because they won, they're positive and they sound this way. We had multiple samples during the year. And then we could backtrack and see, like they would mention a poor relationship with a coach, and this has been going on forever, and I don't know why this person gets selected. And they say that at the Olympics, and we've got their data, and we look back, and we see actually they've never talked about this before. So could this be the fact that because they've lost the high emotion? So we tried to remove the emotion and be quite objective with what we were looking at. They had a very busy environment, the non-medalists. There was a lot happening, and they could describe all of these things going on and new people. There were cars breaking down, some simple things, home life as well. There was instability in their environment. And the repeat medalists had a stability. It may not have been perfectly stable, but what they noticed was stability. And that's what they targeted. And they identified this stable environment around them, and the rest didn't matter. They knew their standard. So, that's in one of your books. I think it's the Golf Tough book. So they know their standard. Erickson pushed that. You have to know where you're heading. The non-medalists didn't clearly know the standard. And there was a lot of hope in what they were hoping to attain. And for some of them, it was a place in the competition, whereas the standard for the repeat medalists had much more depth to it. It had a longevity. It was either a time or a place, or they had something about the path and the journey that was their standard. And the non-medalists had a finish, a result, and it was all this is overgeneralizing, but it didn't work only because of the result. Whereas the repeat medalists, they didn't always win. So I just got to point that out. The assumption was, well, they must have repeatedly. No, they didn't. but they pulled things back. They knew what the core basics were. And so Mahe Drysdale had said that I can innovate because I know what my system is. So I can always go back to that if things don't work. And a lot of people can't say that. They don't know what they're going back to. And the repeat medalists do. So there's a sample of some of them. Dan?
Really interesting. I'd love to reflect back some of the things I've heard. The repeat medalists were hopeful. They had a sense of optimism. They measured what matters. They had a clarity on their reality. It wasn't foggy or hazy. They were clear-minded as to where they are now and where they want to go and potentially what's going to take them there. They had a creation mentality, in as much as rather than fixing problems, which was the non-medalists' mindset, it was more about creating solutions, I suppose, is what I heard. I don't know if that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
There was a stability to them. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe as a sports psychologist, from a stability perspective, I'm thinking about a behavioral stability, an emotional stability, and
Mm-hmm.
a thinking stability. They had a standard, and irrespective of win or lose, they kept to that standard throughout. They had core basics in place, and I suppose all of those are core basics, but they had core basics in place that they could come back to. So it feels like that's a safe place, that they could venture out of that safe place. Almost sounds like a toddler in the first 3 years of their life being able to explore their world but come back to a secure attachment. We're thinking about attachment theory here, and John Bowlby, going back to my basics of developmental psychology. They because they knew their core basics, they could explore, and then if something didn't necessarily work, that's okay because I can come back to my core basics. Those are the kind of attributes that I'm hearing from you from this broad ranging study.
That's right. That's right. And they didn't come in this way. So these were learned behaviors and learned skills, and their coaches sounded the same way. It wasn't just the athlete. The support staff sounded the same way. Their leader sounded the same way about them. So there was an alignment, like a system alignment across the board.
So there was the language, the term we would use in psychology there, and increasingly I'm using this more and more, probably on this podcast, but also in my everyday consultancy practice, the importance of shared mental models, that we start to see the
Mm,
world through a similar lens. We're never going to be completely seeing the world through the same lens, but we see the world through a similar lens, sharing the similar or same language, sharing similar or the same behaviors, which I think is absolutely crucial for any
mhm,
organization that wants to excel. When the coaches, the auxiliary staff, the athletes themselves are talking about the same thing, and
mm.
have really sophisticated conversations around those same things. I think that's, for me, so crucial.
Mm.
And it sounds to me that your years of research and your years of experience suggests the same.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely align mental models, and there's an alignment and understanding of values too. So that's typically where I start in the consulting I do, is at values level, and so there's alignment, and that came out in the medalist, non-medalist as well. There was a deeper understanding of what mattered, alignment of mental models for sure, and the non-medalists were um, more of a novice in the game, even though they had been in the game a long time. We were drawing a conclusion from the performance. So if the performance isn't shifting, why isn't it shifting? And are they just locked in a system, or are they experimenting and it's just not working out? What is it about that? And sometimes it was at this mental model values level that how they described what mattered wasn't clear. And the repeat medals, particularly in teams, they sounded the same. they talked about the same thing in terms of the vocabulary. So their language had been like the All Blacks. So when they're studied for values, they sound the same. Whereas other teams, they've got different words they use, different impressions, different definitions, which in that power of pronouns area was a core of alignment and understanding. How aligned are they in their language? And is there something deeper than that that shows up because of this misalignment in language?
For those listening in, you mention The Power of Pronouns, which is the title of a book. Can you bring that alive for us a little bit? What do you mean by this, and what's an example of a pronoun that might be pertinent within an organisation?
Yeah. So I've probably mentioned the book more than we actually used it, to be honest with you.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So what it pointed to us was there is insight to come from text because we were loaded with millions of words of text. And here was somebody who had made performance decisions based on the text. So the title makes it look like we are only into pronouns. We didn't bother with pronouns. We were curious about the patterns of language and how that related to performance. And could we say something from how clearly people described and what words they used and what their teammates said and what their coaches said and who was aligned and who wasn't, and did that relate to performance? And that is what the power of pronouns pointed to us, that okay, we can dig into some performance insights through the text, because we had a ton of text. We didn't have video. We couldn't reanalyze it. It was just a recording, and no AI or anything back there for any support if we needed any. Not that we'd cut and paste that stuff, but for prompting and things, we did the thematic analysis. We used the phenomenology approach. So we're looking for the meaning. And because we didn't have deep meaning in the initial debriefs, we shifted the tone of the interview so we'd get to the lived experience of everybody and the meaning of that and what would they do next. So that's what deepened our pre-brief process, and that came from the message, the intent of those power of pronoun type books.
And in many respects, how that unpacks at the coalface is through values, and hierarchically, you're putting values at the top of the system by the sounds of it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Would you be willing to share with us how you step into an organization? Because I think in my world, in the world of sports psychology, we talk a lot about a sports psychology consultant going into an organization and helping them set values. And how does that play out for you? How might you go about doing that? Who do you include in that conversation? And what can be the obstacles there for applying those values?
Yeah, yeah. So I've done this a number of times, including just on the weekend with the Olympic coaches here, the athletics coaches
Okay.
here. I have a values diagnostic, and so I use that to determine individual values for people, and then we work together on what those mean. So we put these into concrete meaning for them. The words on their own are not as relevant as what the experience of these values means to people. Um, and and then when you look at the group, and there's a way to add those up, and included in that is thinking style, worldview, leadership style, and these all add up into a values mental model worldview, and just an anchor point for people. Because a lot of the sport, from experience and organizations, deal with the organization values and assume they can connect people before they actually are clear on their own values. And there's often a disconnect, even though there's big hearts and big intent in getting this right. For many, it looks so complicated. Well, if we go individual values, how do we connect that to organizational values? How about we just stick with organizational values, because we've got a consensus here. And
I think that's. Can I just interject there? I think that's a really interesting point because I'd like to have a brief conversation about that because I think I mean I had a conversation with Suze Burton Wiley, who's a sports psychologist at British Sailing, when she came on the show, and
mm,
she talked
mm,
about exactly the same because her research had pointed to that. And I know there is some scholarly research out there that questions not questions the value of values at the organisation level, but speaks to exactly what you said there, which is when your individual values are out of kilter with the organization's value, then it can lead to compliance, for example. The organization is very happy with itself that it's gone through this process of, yeah, we've
mm,
set these values, and it publishes it on their website and looks to that as we're going to form our leadership and our teamwork and our mental models around those things.
mm,
But then forgetting that, societally now, we tend to, most countries now are multicultural, and people come from different experiences,
mm,
backgrounds, religions, beliefs, and so on and so forth. And so marrying up individual values with the organization's values
mm.
is tough. Can you put a bit more meat on the bone as to how you help that to happen, please?
Yeah, yeah. So, and exactly what you've just flagged there of, related to lived experience and diversity of thinking, and there's so much that can be uncovered through exploring values, and I find these are wins every time. Everybody's description of how these values are important to them, how they know when they're being fed, how they know when they're getting their attention when they're not fed, tells us a lot about their journey, where they've come from, how they've dealt with the situations in front of them at a values level. And when those are played to people, they look and say, oh, yeah, I can see that. And the next level is I can actually see when I'm triggered by somebody whose values aren't aligned to mine or an organization. So, for instance, one person was involved in the innovation program for a sport whose values were, I don't have the words right, but it was something like repetition and safety, and there was just tones of risk aversion, and we just get this right, we nail it until we don't get it wrong. These types of things, but this creative new employee had all this innovative energy and said, I don't think my values align. But that isn't the end of the road, really. It's just being aware of that. Well, here's my organization. The organization would come at it. Well, we need safe folk who are reliable. And you've got this innovative tone. I don't know if this is going to work here. But what happened was this person created the innovation program. And that turned out to be exactly what this company needed. And it did turn out to be a safety connected program where they actually had done some work on the safety in the sport. And so it came back around through this person's values. So if the organization, and they were thinking of just moving them on, we don't need an innovation department. That's just not really how we operate here. That's for everybody else, but we don't have time. So there's an example of when we come to the individual, there is alignment, and it isn't assumed alignment. On the hope versus no, those championship capable systems, they know they have alignment. So, like you talked about before of mental model alignment, they know it, and the others hope. Well, I hope everyone's on. They're nodding. And we've done the mission, we've done the vision, and these are all compelling words. And we've had the consultants come in, and it looks good. How can they not be aligned? Well, the problem is their values haven't been made clear to them. And so they can't build this explicit bridge between organization values and personal values. And when that's done, then there's alignment. And then there's the system's humming, the team's humming, fewer questions being asked.
What I'm hearing you say, or at least what I'm processing in my mind, is the importance of putting in the hard work around the values. That actually
Mm,
that initial value session isn't enough. That then you need to have those sophisticated conversations with the individuals in order to help them align their own personal values with the values that the organization has. And it makes me think of the conversation I had with Andrea First, who was the Great Britain hockey sports psych 2016 when they won the gold medal in Rio, and she spoke about they spent about 6 sessions, 12 hours, speaking with players about this as a group, which demonstrates. I'm not suggesting that the conversations they had are anything to do with the players aligning their values with the GB hockey team values. I'm not too sure what conversations there were, but I think maybe guilty within organisations can be, within teams, can be this idea, as I say, that you lay down these values, but then you don't do the hard work. They're kind of left behind, and something that I suppose what speaks slightly to this is something I'm keen to do is when I do a value session, I'm trying to help the coaches consider how they're going to help their players continue to align with and work on these values. And you can, you can take these values out onto the pitch, the court, the course with you and work on them in activities in training. It's got to be an everyday thing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I know, like, from reading your work as well, there's such a heavy values tone
Mm.
to your work. It's a deep alignment under the game. Your F1 work, your Premiership work, your books. And the ones who've done the work, as you said just before, it starts to pay off. And sometimes it is what happens way, way, way before the field, before they take to the pitch. Like the medals are won months and years before. And it starts with, where is the leverage? So are we going to be dealing technical, tactical right as soon as we get here? Or are we going to deeply understand ourselves, our lived experience, and what we bring to this game before we start dealing with how we play the game? And the sports that do that, and business as well. So work with leaders and senior leadership teams when they back up a bit from all the busy, all the problem solving, and they just revisit who they are at a values level. It just resets the compass, and they can accelerate with not much more. So the system doesn't need a full rebuild. It's actually their start point just needs to be revisited. That's what I find.
From listening to what you're saying, it sounds like the performance systems you speak of straddle two worlds. They straddle the world of the sort of the traditional high performance approaches, from your studies into medalists. You've demonstrated a series of philosophies, underpinning philosophies that they will have: the clarity, the creation, the stability, the core basics, etc., etc. And that these things lend themselves towards high performance. On the other side of things, um, from your experience at the Olympics, you spoke earlier about the importance of looking deeper than the medal, and again, to use that word, values and the ideals. But it sounds to me that you're straddling two worlds: the high performance world, but the sort of the emotional well-being, mental health, supportive side of things, where this is a human being and we want human beings to have great experiences in the Olympics. We want human beings to have great experiences within their organizations, within their environment, sort of bringing high performance and human experience together, if that makes sense.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the lived experience of their history, but the experience of high performance. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely right. The first book I wrote called Simplify, and that's the performance system book. The second one just came back from the editor, so that's probably a month away or so. Is called Amplify, and that's about performance leadership. So in the system, typically the bottleneck is leadership. And I don't mean the role of someone called leader. It's everybody's leadership. Everybody in the system is a leader in some way, and it's their leadership. And so you point out to one area, there's a triangle that came from mostly the more recent research the past 4 years on this comparison of systems, is that they are simple, they're aligned, and they're well, and they are systemically simple, aligned and well. And you've raised a couple of aspects of what alignment looks like, mental models and values, and what well-being looks like in a system. More than healthy habits and life well lived, it's performing well in any moment, no matter what.
This is really interesting, and I love that simple, using that word, triangle, where the 3 points resemble simple, aligned, and well. In your new book, Amplify, and just unpacking that a little bit for us here. I mean, you mentioned leadership from the perspective of everyone's a leader. Just yeah, I'd really love you to unpack that a bit, because I think you might get some people pushing back a little bit there and saying, "Well, everybody's a leader." What do you mean by that, Richard?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a decision rather than a position, and there's more work put into creating leaders and learners in our athletes than there is just a performer. So there's and I unpack this in the book as well. Four roles that we circle through. We are all leaders. We're all learners. We're all contributors. We're not alone. We're with some people, and we're helping, and we're performing. So we also personally have to deliver. So it's not just the final, it's not just the penalty kick. It's everybody has every role, and there's a dynamic moving through those four. And sometimes our leadership, because we think that's our boss, old school thinking, when really it's me and how I'm leading my area, how I'm leading my own system. Am I aware? I can't lead unless I'm aware, and that typically points a gap in in leadership. There's a lot to do with self awareness, environmental awareness, moment awareness. So very focused areas on your specializations and the power that you have in your work as well. So I've just framed this as leadership, and then there's a number of components that fit under leadership. But yeah, it isn't a role, and it isn't waiting for my boss to decide.
I think that's really interesting, and it interests me because, again, my own consultancy practice has emerged this way. In as much as, when I think of a sporting organisation filled with people, I agree with you. I'm seeing a bunch of leaders, a bunch of learners, contributors, and I think that fourth one is performers.
Performer, that's right.
Yeah, performer. So I like that idea of this all-in proposition that everybody plays these roles, and can we be? It sounds to me like you're asking for effective individuals within these four spheres within the team.
Mm.
That to me sounds like it's the optimal environment to you.
That's right. That's right. And there's a flex, there's a dynamic through that. So we know what our role requires of us at any given moment. Sometimes we need to perform. Sometimes we need to contribute. Sometimes we need to lead. And sometimes this is a learning game. And we know what the role requires of us. So in those championship capable systems, repeat medal winning systems, there's a clarity of the role and who I am at any given time. The others are locked in a role. And some of this just novice to expert standards here that they haven't had the experience of moving through the roles. So part of the system is around awareness building for people. Hey, do you know, performer, you're more than a snowboarder. You're going to be all four parts of this. What do you mean? I'm a leader. Why am I a leader? I'm a 14-year-old. Well, here's what leadership looks like in your context. Here's what being a learner. When we move around all these, how cool does that sound? Do you think you'd be a better snowboarder? Oh yeah, for sure. I'd be able to read the snow. I'd be able to deal with my competitors. I'd probably arrive on time. This is actually a real example of an interview with a snowboarder, and how he put it into context for him was very simple, but he got it just as long as we'd framed these quadrants for him. So just an education process on awareness, and then leave it to them to fit. Okay, what's your context look like there? But you're more than just an athlete who's a 100-meter runner. There's more to you.
There's more to you than just that 100-meter runner.
Mm.
I think this is a fascinating area, because I think that, again, very relevant to things that I'm experiencing, and I just want to dwell on maybe where there might be pushback here, because if you go back to your coaching in the early 90s, but you're very much a coach now in a different vein. But if you think about your cycling competitors that you were coaching back then, I wonder where you might get the challenges, the vocal challenges, the pushback might be, because this is something that I'm preaching every day. So we sing from the same song sheet, in as much as I think, when I think of the players in, let's say, the clubs, the football clubs, the soccer clubs that I'm working in, I'm thinking about them as performers, yes. And I
Mm,
think that they would identify themselves as performers only, in many respects, many of them. Not necessarily, yes, learners, but they wouldn't overtly say that.
mm,
Certainly, many of them wouldn't see themselves as leaders. Many of them wouldn't see themselves necessarily as contributors towards others or
mm,
towards the organisation, just simply because these things haven't been part of their vocabulary. And
mm,
I also think that many coaches might be a bit scared, because they might say, well, to use a psychological term, we don't want to increase the cognitive load so much that players can't take on board all of this information and then can't perform the role of a performer. So that's a kind of a basic pushback I kind of feel that one gets when one considers multiple roles of the
mm,
individual.
mm,
Any thoughts from you on that one?
Yeah, there's definitely, Dan, there would definitely be pushback. And depending on the era you come from, including the shift in expectation that new athletes have, the world is very different, in 5 years. Look where we've come from, COVID and war and Me Too and pronoun and gender and all sorts of things that need to be discussed, debated, aligned, etc. All fair stuff, but this is the world our new people are coming
Yeah.
from, and so when you look at words like leadership, for sure, alignment is alignment of language and behavior, and unless we're clear on what those words mean, we won't get anywhere. And many times, people are desperate to put their hand up and say, "I don't know what you mean by even high performance." Like, well, what is that? But they can't, because we're in a system that's got a lot of momentum. Look how many medals and premiership or whatever it is we've won. There's a lot of history, and that carries sometimes, a quiet with it. There's more blind spots in experts. That's one thing the Dreyfus brothers said. I said, "What's the difference between experts and masters?" Masters have fewer blind spots. Well, that's gold.
Mm.
And experts have been in the game so long. So we do work on that, is making these assumptions visible. So language like leadership in an athlete, putting it into their context, well, that's leading by example. Are you like that as a player? Or is it just, you get away with whatever you can? And this is what stood out to me as a cyclist. I thought, boy, the best in the game really are leading. They care about the rest of us. They're prompting, they're questioning, they're sitting with the newbies for breakfast, they're asking them questions, and the rest of us are just trying to fit in and deliver. And so, the kind of resilience, what kind of communication style do you have? Do you think you're communicating like a leader? Or is it F bombs and everything else, and you're just putting everybody offside and doing it for some drama? Are you accountable? What's that like for you? So just some basic leadership like qualities. And so now, what does that box look like to you as a young athlete?
Interesting. Interesting. Richard, absolutely fascinating. It sounds like an awesome book, and one I'm really, really looking forward to reading. And what an amazing conversation! I can't thank you enough. What a rich history you have in sport, and from coaching, competing to coaching to just breaking down high performance and creating models that are absolutely imperative, I think, for organizations, teams, and individuals to have. Look, first and foremost, thank you so much. And how can people find you, follow you, get in contact, and find your old book and your upcoming book?
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks so much for the opportunity. You're your books are fantastic. The Golf Tough is an awesome
Thank you.
book that I've bought. I'm going to get the soccer books too. Love the theming. Love your posts on LinkedIn. So that's where most of my social connection is. LinkedIn. I don't have space and time to do the others. So I'm on LinkedIn. My website is Richard N. For Norman, but don't tell anybody. Richard N. N. Young. .com or simplify number 2 perform.com, same site, and the book is on Amazon and Amplify. That's Simplify, and Amplify will be out in a month. And those behaviors, there's a couple of white papers that I have on the website. And so those medalist behaviors that I was just talking about, there's a paper called 5,000 Hours, which is a play on Anders Ericsson's 10,000. If we get it right, we might be able to do 5,000. So it's just an example, just a quirky title there. Anyways, that's got the clock, which is the 12 learned skills of the medalists. And there's a couple other free papers on there as well, Dan.
Brilliant. Richard, thank you so much for today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Awesome conversation, Dan. And I love the podcast too. There's 2 that I've listened to. I've got so much out of this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Wow, everybody, I really enjoyed that episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.